This presentation is going to look at a key research area of small block disk forensics and triage, especially looking at some of the research around this area and trying to understand the core fundamental principles. The research itself, you'll find, is based around a paper written by Simpson-Garfinkel, and we just find it here, and it should be used for associated reading. It was published in 2010 and focuses on these purpose-built functions and block hashes for small block and sub-file forensics. So as part of this, we'll have a quick look at the main outline of the presentation, especially looking at some of the issues around this area and of digital forensics at the present time. Then we'll look at the basic disk structures, especially on how files are organized for them. We'll look at basic triage systems and why we actually need them. Then we'll look at basic file signatures for identifying our files, and then if we look within files we can find key discriminators so that we don't actually have to view the header or the footer of a file. We can dive into anywhere in the file and hopefully try and identify it. So as part of that we'll look at contraband identification, and then we'll go on to the final part of the presentation, which is sector-based hashing. Okay, so part of the digital forensics investigation system normally involves the collection of digital information. We then archive it or image it in some way, and we try to preserve that digital information. It's then on to the analysis part, and then finally on to the reporting part. So it could be as part of a business, or it could be part of some sort of legal investigation. ACPO present a guideline, so it must be seen as a guideline, and it's seen as best practice in the area. And they define that no law enforcement agencies or their agents shall change data held on a computer or on a storage media which may be relied on in court in the future. The biggest problem with this is that it is very difficult not to change data. So even turning the power off, even doing some lightweight analysis of the system involves changing the data and the system in some way. So it's likely that there will be some focus on possibly changing this type of law. So as long as we don't actually damage our data or really modify it in a way that would make it different, then it's probably acceptable to do some sort of initial triage on a system. People must be competent to analyse the data. There must be an audit trail involved, and also there is one person in charge, such as a case officer, to make sure that all the basic principles are adhered to. But it's this first one that is quite difficult at the current time to actually enforce, especially as disk systems are becoming larger. So the problem that we have currently is that in some parts of the UK, for example, it can take weeks, months and even years for a disk for data to be imaged and preserved. So this can be a fairly lengthy time between the seizure to the actual archiving or imaging of the data, which makes it quite difficult to then do the analysis in a reasonable time limit. Along with this, it's becoming a lengthy process. So at one time we had 10 or 40 gigabyte hard disks, and it didn't take too long. But these days it's not untypical to see 1 and 1.5 terabyte, even 2 or 4 terabyte disks that can be mounted onto network drives and so on. So assuming something like a firewire interface which has speeds of several hundred megabits per second or 20 megabytes per second, it can take about 75,000 seconds to image the whole disk, and taking at least 20 hours. So often it can take a day to actually archive or image a whole disk. Along with this, the number of electronic devices which have memory storage and processors increases by the day. We have mobile phones which can have gigabytes of data, iPads, netbooks, USB sticks, cameras, Xboxes and so on. So the number of devices that we have that really require to go through this process is increasing by the day, and the size of the storage on these systems also increases. There's now a need for much quicker responses to the analysis of the data, such as in border control applications. And this involves some sort of real-time analysis of the system. So really we need to measure the time to go from the collection, preservation to analysis to be measured in minutes, if not seconds. There's an increasing need for first responder analysis. So a first responder will generally get to an incident. It could be a denial of service attack or a major power outage, and it is important that they respond correctly so that they preserve any data. So that often involves not switching computers off, making sure that they can do some initial analysis of the damage that's happened on a system. There's also a need to discover whether we should take the power away before we do the imaging, because some of the data, especially if it's resident within inside the memory of the machine or processes that are running, could be destroyed when the power is taken away. We still very much focus on disk and the static analysis of disks, where more and more users are working within the cloud and also dynamically on systems. So switching the power off can lose a lot of data or information that could be used for a future investigation. Along with this, a system that's running probably is still usable, and taking the power away can sometimes damage the system, or at least difficult to get the system to work again. Along with this, the system to really piece back together file systems requires a fairly high computing intensive system, especially to buffer all the file fragments and build them into the larger files. Okay, so let's look at the basic principle of triage. So we've seen the normal process, CPAR, collection, preservation, analysis and reporting. So we've seen the issues that are involved in going through this process. It can be a lengthy process from collection to analysis. More and more devices are actually storing digital information and can have trails of evidence on them. So triage involves really having a quick analysis of our digital information on our devices to see if we can return it back without requiring to go through this whole CPAR process. If we find that there's something interesting, then we would normally send it through that process. So some of the things that we might ask is there contraband material on it? Does it have any running processes and threads that require to be preserved? Will the system destroy itself if we shut it down? So some things like mobile phones can actually destroy the data once we actually shut them down and bring them back again, especially if they require a password, as the disk systems can be protected in that way. What's the basic makeup of the system? How much content, how much music, how much movie files and so on, how much encrypted content is on the disk? And will any networked type connections, cloud infrastructure information be lost? So the minute we switch a computer off, then we obviously break the links with any cloud infrastructure, with any network connections that we have, and it can be difficult to restore these back. So more and more, much of the data that's actually used within systems is actually cloud-based. So possibly the last thing that we want to do is to shut a system down and then to try to connect to these things again. Normally when we do, then these systems are sandboxed, so they can't actually connect to the network because that might change the data in some way. So at this point here, we may need to make a decision as to whether we really preserve the running state, look at all the processes that are running, look at the cloud connections and network connections and so on, and make some valued decision about whether we should actually try to preserve these in the same way as we would do with the static information on the disk. So some of the things that we might do if we were allowed to do a triage on the system is to really sample the disk, and we'll see a technique for this later on. We might go in and sample points on the disk to see if we can identify if there is any contraband material. We might examine the processes and any threats that there are on the machine, analyze registries and the file structures, check for errors on the system, check the system configuration, hardware and so on, and how it's set up, and especially onto connected devices and onto network connections. We probably need to identify if there's any encrypted content present on the disk. Losing the power may make it difficult to recover that encrypted content in the future. We could examine for any malware. Often a defense is that it was malware that actually caused the system to work incorrectly and download the contraband material. So it's a useful thing to know if the actual malware was running at the given time the machine was confiscated. There might be user and audit log activity. Sometimes when a machine is powered down, then we actually lose any auditing that's occurred in any user activity. So by preserving it, then we can make sure that the system will keep that. We might examine the running memory of the machine, and even with things like mobile phones, we can check the location information as to where it's been, what its trajectory has been, and so on. Okay, so before we look at some of the ways that we can analyze the fragments of files on a disk, we'll have a look at some basic disk structures and see if we can understand how they operate. Okay, within a disk we have what's called the file allocation table, and the disk itself is made up of a number of clusters. Okay, so here's cluster 0. And then each cluster is made up of a number of sectors. So in this case we might have n clusters, and then we have a number of clusters, sectors per cluster, 2, 4 and so on, up to 128. And then we can have a number of bytes in each of these sectors. So in this way the files are actually stored within inside these clusters. So what we have on the system is that each cluster number is stored on within the file allocation table, and then there is some allocation given to that cluster that we'll see in a little minute. For a 16-bit cluster entry, we have 16 bits to identify the cluster number, which gives us 2 to the power of 16, or 65,000 odd entries within inside this FAT table. With FAT32, we have 28 bits set aside for the cluster number, which gives us 256 mega entries. So as an example, we might format for FAT16, which is the most compatible format that we can get for systems. And within inside this we might go for 64 sectors in each of these clusters. Each sector has 512 bytes in it, so which makes each of the cluster sizes 32 kilobytes. If we make the cluster sizes too big, then obviously they'll be very wasteful when we're actually storing our files. So we typically make them a reasonable size to be able to use the disk efficiently. The smaller we can make them and the larger the number of clusters, the more efficient the disk storage will actually be. So in terms of this, the 32 kilobytes per cluster, and we have about 64,000 clusters, that gives us 2 gigabytes of formattable disk space. So that's why in a USB stick, if we want to make it as compatible as possible, and we format for FAT16, 2 gigabytes is the limit that we can actually have. With FAT32, we have many more of these clusters, and if we go for a typical format that we would get, 16 sectors per cluster, with 512 bytes in each sector, that gives us only 8 kilobytes per cluster, quite an efficient size of a cluster. As we have many more of these, that gives us up to 2 terabytes of formattable space. So often we see within a USB stick that 2 gig is the limit, and that's really to keep compatibility with older systems. So the way the files are stored is that what we have is a directory entry. We have the file name, and then we have the starting cluster number. So the starting cluster number will relate to where the file is actually stored. So in this case it might be cluster number 1. And then if we look in cluster number 1, then there is some allocation here. So the allocations we can have in the FAT table is that if we have a value between 2 and FFEF, then it means that it tells us where the next cluster is. When files are stored, they're stored across these clusters, but they don't have to be necessarily contiguous. And a file could be stored here, and here, and here. So what we get is a chain. That cluster leads on to that one by identifying the next cluster number. Then that cluster number leads on to the next one, and so on. At the very end of the clusters, for the last cluster that we use, we identify in the file allocation table an end of cluster number of all Fs. If the system identifies a bad cluster, then it marks it in the file allocation table with FFF7. So in that way, parts of the disks can be blanked off as to not be stored to. Okay, so let's look at an example. So we have some files, so we can see here help.doc is stored across 2 files. We can see 2 clusters. You can see that it's filled up the complete cluster here, but it's only used part of the cluster over here. Text.test doesn't use up the whole cluster, and manages to finish within that one. And then me.jpg is stored across 2 clusters. You can see here, this is the wasted space here, and also here. So that's why it's better to make the cluster sizes as small as possible. Okay, so the first file, what we do is we mark in the entry as to where the first cluster should be. So in this case, this is in cluster 1. Okay, so over here, this is the file allocation table entry for cluster 1. And we can see here that for test.tst, it's the final cluster. So we would mark that with the hexadecimal of all Fs. F, 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 F. Okay, so help.doc is the next one. So the first cluster is 0. Okay, so within 0, we would mark that the next cluster is going to be 5. Okay, so that changes from here to here. And then inside cluster 5, we've obviously got to the end. So here we would put in that this is the end cluster. So we'd put in all Fs for that one too. Next, me.jpg. So me.jpg is 8 here. With inside 8, we need to tell it the next cluster, which is 6. And then within 6, we want to define as the end of them. Okay, so it's important to realize that the file will have an end of file to identify it. This is different from the end of cluster, which is the last cluster node. So you can see the problems that we can have here. So if we lose this chain in some way, if our flat table gets corrupted in some way, then we can actually lose the chain of these clusters. Along with this, we might end up with a disk which is highly fragmented. So we might have clusters, files stored in clusters all over the place, and it becomes difficult for the disk because it's jumping back and forward. So defrag will generally try to place files contiguously across these clusters, and will generally reorganize them. The other thing that this gives us is that we can see here when we actually delete a file, it is only deleted from the directory entry, but the file itself is still stored, so it's possible to recover any undeleted items by looking at the basic chain, finding the start of the file, and then to be able to follow the chains through to actually find its fragments. Along with this, we can see after a certain amount of time, parts of the file could be erased, but you can still see the fragments can still exist, and hopefully we'll show later that we can actually still identify any of the elements of the file to prove that the whole file existed at one time. Okay, so there's our completed entry. So test.txt appears at cluster 1, and it's the end of that cluster, so the whole file is stored in there. Help.doc is in cluster 0, which is there, and the next cluster is 5, so we're here, of which that's the end, so cluster 5 is here. And then me.jpg is on cluster 8, our next cluster is 6, and that is defined with an end last cluster identifier. So one of the most basic methods that we can have in detecting file content is to look at the basic file signature. So this typically involves looking at the header or the footer of a file, or looking for key contents inside it. It's basically getting a signature of what our file should look like. So this is often used when we've maybe deleted a file. So it could be deleted from the file allocation table, but by searching deeply on the disk we can actually find content which has been deleted. So this shows an example. So the standard first 3 bytes that we get within a GIF file are 474946, which equate to the letters GIF, and that identifies that this is a GIF file. So we'll have a look at the toolkit that we have associated with the presentation. Okay, so we just open Binary Reader. We'll have a look to see if we can find a GIF file. There's one there. Okay, so this shows the content of what's in the file, and we can see here that's what it looks like. But it's these first 3 bytes that identify the GIF file. Hopefully we can identify the file type just by identifying those first 3 characters. So other signatures that we might have include this FFD8FF for a JPEG, and we might see for a zip file 54B03. So we can see here, over here, for our zip file, that's the first 3 bytes that we can see. A PDF, we often see the %PDF at the start and then the %EOF actually at the end somewhere within a PDF file. The various other signatures that we have, such as PowerPoint, Microsoft databases, Outlook, mail files, the MSR files, and so on. The strange one here is that we can actually see that docx, pptx, and xls all have the same starting file signature. That file signature is the same as the zip file, so we can actually see that what we have is actually a zip file. So there's a docx, and we can see here that the first few characters of this is actually the same as a zip. So these files themselves are actually zip files. So if we have a look at one of these, and then we should be able to see the basic content of this. So let's see if we can find docx. Okay, so let's copy that document into a zip file. Open up the zip file, and we can see here that it is a zip file. So the zip file contains all the XML, all the actual media that we have within inside the document, and so on. So if we detect a PK file, then it might actually be a docx file. Flash files we can identify with WFWS. MP3 files typically have a header, an ID3 tag at the start of them. We'll see that a little bit later. TIFF files and so on. There's some movie files. All of these are standard file signatures. Okay, so here is a JPEG. We can see here there's the FFD8 at the start. Then we get some values after that, and then within 2 bytes we see the standard JFIF after that. Often too, the basic content, the metadata within the file identifies other things, and the information obviously often comes in as it was taken. So you can see here the actual core, though this is a PowerPoint file, the core name of the image file which it was used to import into the PowerPoint has still been preserved. Okay, so this is a zip file. So the zip file we can identify with these first few bytes that we see. So this is a Little Indian format, and then from that we can see other information about it. We can also see things like the file names of the zip file with inside the header. One of the tools that we can use to actually discover and interrogate our disk systems is Scalpel. So Scalpel is a package which will read in the raw file. So Simpson Garfinkel has a number of these pre-prepared images that can be used for research purposes in order to be able to evaluate the quality of digital forensics tools. So with inside the configuration file we can actually define what we're actually looking for, whether it's a case sensitive search, the maximum file size, because often we don't want to keep carving away at a file and get bigger and bigger, so we can define a maximum size. Then we can define the header that we're looking for, and if there's actually a footer. So in this case we're looking for an AVI, we look for RIFF, anything, 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 and then AVI after it. Okay, so let's have a look at that. Okay, so we've downloaded a number of these pre-prepared raw images. So these ones are from a Canon camera and contain images, and we have ones related to emails. So what we'll do is that we'll carve out the JPEG files. So the actual definition of the signatures for Scalpel are contained within the configuration file. So we can see here for a JPEG, it's case sensitive. We're looking for that sequence as a header and this one as a footer, as we've shown before. Some other signatures that we have, there's the GIF ones. We're looking for this sequence at the start and this one at the end. PNG is here. TIFF, Apple QuickTime, looking for these ones. Mpeg, Flash, as we've seen before, and so on. Okay, so we can uncomment any of these if we want to be able to use it with inside Scalpel. So what we'll do is that we'll then go ahead and cut through our file. Spell it right. Okay, so it's processing it, and okay, so let's look at using Scalpel to carve out the JPEGs with inside the file. Okay, so we can see there's been 70 files carved out there, and then we'll just go into the folder, which is out 13, and there is a basic audit of what we've actually done with inside there to show our basic audit trail and how we've analysed. And then with inside here there is a folder which contains all the files that we've carved out from the raw image. Okay, so we can use tools such as Scalpel to do this. The program that we have here also is able to detect our files. So we'll have a look. We've had a look at file signatures, and that typically involves a lot of file discriminators. So where we can delve into the middle of a file or at any part of it and actually determine what the file type actually is. In this way we could perform some sort of triage on the disk. So we'll look at two main types of files, JPEG and MP3, and see if we can actually find these diskers that allow to sample with inside the sector blocks. The way that a JPEG works is that we take an image and then we segment it into 8 by 8 pixel blocks. We then process each of these pixel blocks independently hopefully trying to compress the file down more and more each time. So with inside a 8x8 pixel block, what we do is we took a frequency or a spatial analysis of the pixel block. So for the first pixel block, we look at the low frequency changes with inside the pixel block. This is typically taking an average of all the pixels across the pixel block. We do this with color, and we also do it with the luminosity. So we process these separately. And what we get is when we process for higher and higher frequency changes through each of these filtering elements. So here, the one at the very top is high frequency changes with inside our pixel block. We're more likely to have low frequency changes. So we see here, this is the data from a real file, that most of our large values are occurring in this zone here. This is because as we zoom into an image, there are less and less changes in pixels across these small pixel blocks. So the components up here and in the sort of high region are unlikely to be large. So the next thing we do is that we then quantize these values, and what we typically do is divide each value by a certain number, and that divides then becomes our result here. So you can see that some of these numbers are so small that when we divide them by anything, it ends up with a value of 0. Next, what we do is that we store the values in a zigzag fashion, like this. And we see from here that we end up with long runs of 0, as we can see here in a standard processed result. Then what we do is that we use Huffman coding. And Huffman coding is a useful method in that what it does is it will take a sequence such as long runs of zeros and create a small code for it. So in this case we might have 4 zeros followed by a value, in this case 2, and then we can define the data value, which is 2, define a number of zeros again, and so on. So in this way we can actually create a very small code for long sequences of the same value, typically 0. This allows us to compress our data down into an almost minimal state. The value of all zeros should never actually occur, and we'll see how that's used in a little minute. So if we take an image, such as this one here, when we feed it in, we actually find that JPEG header has a number of tags that are fairly standard. So there's the start of the file, that's the tag for the quantization table, as we've seen when we were doing our quantization, and several other tags such as the Huffman table and so on. One thing that appears is obviously when we start to store the data, we might get values of FF. In this case, we don't want them to be seen as part of these tags. So what we do is we stuff a 00 after the F to make sure that it's not confused with these things. The 00 is then ignored. So if we actually look at an example, so in this case what we're going to do is that we're going to look at the byte array. Okay, so we read from the byte array of a file. We get into a byte array, and then we process each byte one at a time. And then from there, we look at 2 consecutive bytes. So it's a little Endian format. So we take the byte that we've read further on, and then we take the byte before it, and then we move that one up 8 spaces, which makes it a more significant byte, and we bring them both together. Okay, so in this case we're looking for the first byte to be an F and the second byte to be a C0, and then we'll print the value. If we detect an FF with a 00, then we can define that it's a likely Huffman coding. If we can detect the Huffman coding within inside the segments, then there's a very good chance we can actually detect that any of the fragments or sectors are actually contains a JPEG file. So what we'll do is we'll run that. Okay, while that's running, we'll have a look at some sample results. So in this case we can see here are the tags being analysed for the header, and then we can see that in each of these 5112 blocks there is the value of FF00, which is a likely Huffman coding, and this is likely to identify a JPEG file. And there we see this is the end one here. Let's see if our program is started. Okay, so we'll open up our JPEG. Okay, so there's our tag. There's another one here, and we'll see another one here, and so on. So hopefully later on we should be able to see some FF00 tags. And there was one there, we just missed it. Hopefully each sector will contain an FF00 tag. So let's actually do our analysis. So we can see here, there it's found the main tags there, and then we can see in each of the segments it's finding a likely Huffman coding of FF00. It's difficult to see from the information, but it should be there. Okay, so within each of these we can see that there is a likely Huffman coding because there's a stuffed FF in each of the segments. Okay, so a very quick analysis finds that segments 7, 8, 10, 11 and so on all have these stuffed values. So there's a very good chance when we sample that we can actually detect that this is a likely JPEG image. Especially if we bring together some of these 512 segments into larger data blocks. The other file that we're going to have a look at is Mpeg3. So Mpeg3 either has an ID header or it could be a core Mpeg file. Okay, so let's have a little look at a sample. Okay, so let's look at an MP3 file. In this case, we can see it has an ID3 header. You can see some information about the actual track, the album, and so on, all contained within inside this header file. How an Mpeg3 file is actually created is that we have a number of frames, and then the frames are then added onto the Mpeg3 file in a fairly independent way, but one which is sequential. So if we get an error in one, then it's possible to resynchronize with another one. There is no byte boundaries that we have, say in a JPEG, and the header, these frames can occur in any place within inside the byte position. What we see though is that we see first 12 bits of one called an MP3 sync at the start of each of these frames. This allows the MP3 to synchronize its streaming. After that we get the version number, the layer, error protection, and then a key of the bit rate 1010 defines that we have a high quality 160 megabits per second bit rate, and then we have the sampling rate. So it's possible to actually find out what the actual frame size is from each of these values, and we can do an additional check to make sure that our frame sizes are correct and that we should see a header appearing within one frame size of one that we've just detected. So a key thing for us now is to identify 12 ones in a row. If we can do that, then we can identify that this is a possible Mpeg3 file. Okay, so let's go to our program. And how we detect this one is that we take 2 bytes together and we form them into a 16-bit value, little Indian. Okay, so we take the value with red that's further on, and then we take that value and move it up 8 spaces to make us 16 bits. Then what we do is we take that value and then we mask off the bottom 12 bits, and the rest of the bits become 0, and we detect if those bits are actually set to a 1. If they are, we'll print out that this is a possible 12-bit sequence and define the value. Okay, so let's run it and import an Mpeg3 file to see if we can determine these discriminators. And what we're really looking for is the 12 ones with inside of these 512 byte blocks. Okay, so we'll just open up a small Mpeg file. Okay, and then we'll do an Mpeg analysis, and we can see here it's found quite a few of these 12-bit sequence values within the segments. Okay, so we've found it in virtually every segment that we looked at in there. So there's a good chance we can actually determine, especially if we look for these 12-bit ones between the frames. If we can determine the frame size, then we can easily determine that the file is an Mpeg file. Okay, so let's see if we can identify contraband on a disk by sampling the basic sectors within inside it. Okay, so first let's start with a very simple problem. So we have 20 red squares and we have 5 black squares. So we must work out what's the probability of us not selecting a black square. So as we have 25 in total and we have 25 red, then the probability will be 20 over 25, or a 0.8 or 80% chance that we won't select a black square. And obviously we have a 20% chance that we will select black. So now let's take away one of the red squares. And now what we have is that we have only 24 squares in total and we only have 19 squares. So the chances of us selecting 2 reds and not a black at all is 20 divided by 25 times 19 times divided by 24. So we now have a 63% chance of not selecting a black square, or a 27 that there is a black square in there. Now we take another one away and we'll have 18 red and only 23 tiles. So now we see the chances are of that happening are roughly 50-50, that by this time the chances of us selecting 3 reds without ever selecting a black tile is now 49%. And then we go on, it's now 38% if we select 4 times without replacing and going back to the same square, and so on. But now we can see that for 4 reds there's a 62% chance that we will have at least 1 black tile within inside that. So if we keep going, we can actually see that the chances of us selecting a black tile increases to 94 after 10 goes, 96, 98 and so on. So we can see that we increase in confidence that we're likely to hit a black tile within a certain number of picks. So this is important, as if we're looking for contraband, we need to understand how many times we need to sample before we could actually see if we can pick up a contraband content. So in the paper, the probability is defined by this formula. This is a multiplication of these values. I is the number of times that we actually sample. So n, if we have n sectors, and m sectors with contraband, and n is the number of tries, then we can actually calculate for certain disk sizes our confidence level of picking up a contraband sector if we sample. So for example, if we take a 1 terabyte disk, there are 2,512 byte sectors. If we say a contraband of 100 megabytes, then we have 200,000 of these 512 byte sectors. And if we sample 50,000 times, then we actually find the probability of not finding some contraband is only 0.67%, or the probability of actually finding it is 99.33%. Okay, so we'll actually have a little program here which does this. Okay, so we can use a little program here to determine the chances of detecting the contraband. So we might select a 1 terabyte disk, which gives us this number of sectors, and 100 megabytes of contraband. If we sample for 50,000 times, we can see here that the probability of finding the contraband, if we look at each sector, is 99.326%. If we try for 25%, then we still have a 97.79% chance of finding the contraband just with 25,000 samples. So in this way we can see that we don't need to actually sample the whole of a disk. We possibly just need to be able to sample, and we can actually fairly confidently define what if we've managed to detect any contraband. So now that we've actually seen that it's possible to sample with inside these sectors, an extension of this is to look at sector-based hashing. So the normal way that contraband material is detected is that we take the contraband material and we generate some sort of hash signature for it. The problem with that is that we'd have to build back the whole file again and check its signature, hash signature, and that can take quite a long time, scanning virtually the whole of the disk and trying to build back the signature again. Along with this, parts of the file might be missed. 1 pixel could be changed, and that will change the whole of the hash signature. In this case, we change 1 pixel and it will create a completely new hash signature and it won't be detected. An improved method is to look at each of the 512 byte blocks and to generate an individual hash signature. So if we can detect inside each of these byte blocks that hash signature, then it's likely that the whole of the content either exists on the disk or has done in the past. In the paper, the Bloom's filters are used to be able to efficiently store and process these hash signatures. So in this way we can build up a large database with these signatures. We can then sample, as we've seen, we could sample 50,000 times onto the disk of a 1.5 terabyte disk, and then if we can actually check the hash signature of each 512 block, then we could check it with the contraband sector hashing blocks. So the advantage is that we can get fast triage to be able to detect malicious or contraband material. It's possible to detect the whole presence of a file purely by detecting one element of it. The downside is that we require a much larger database of hashes. We need to process them from their large size into their 512 byte blocks. But Bloom filters can be used for this. And along with this, there needs to be an acceptance that triage methods are actually possible within law enforcement. So it is necessary that we can go in and do a basic triage before doing the full analysis. So in this case, the identification of a hashed byte block matching might identify that we need to look more deeply into the whole of the disk. Okay, so in basic conclusions, we've looked at many different areas inside here. We've found out that our disks are clustered together, and that the file allocation table defines how we then jump between these clusters. Then we looked at how we can use this method to be able to look at the basic file signatures of determining the headers, and then on to discriminators, where we looked at certain key things to detect JPEG and MPEG-3 and so on. From there we looked at the basic probability of being able to find content purely by sampling a disk, and then on to looking at byte block hash signatures to be able to detect the presence of contraband material.